Our reading today is from Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right, and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was ill, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you ill or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was ill and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or ill or in prison and did not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life.
Great, thanks, Dave. All right, it's going to switch over to a yellow microphone. And great, there we go. Excellent. Hi, everyone. When I was young, my bedroom was an absolute disaster area. All the time, I would be asked to tidy it up, and I would kind of start doing it, and then 4.5 seconds later, I would then get distracted by 14 other things that I was doing that was clearly much more interesting than tidying a bedroom. And my mother used to come up, and she would open the door, she'd walk into the room, and she would say, "This room looks like a bomb has hit it." And I didn't know what that was, because I didn't understand that what she was actually saying then was, bomb has hit it, just very quickly. And for a long time, I thought a bomb has hit it was something that was very untidy. And I would say to my mother, "What is a bomb has hit it?" And then she would just assume that I was being cheeky and not actually tell me. It took me a long time before I realized that was indeed an actual sentence and not an individual word. Sometimes we hear things. And we realized later on that we didn't quite get it right, that we didn't quite listen to what was actually being said. But there are some other times where we hear things and we assume that we must have got it wrong. We've assumed that what that person has said isn't actually what they have said. Surely I've misheard that. Did he really say that? I feel like there must be some of us who think that about some of the things that we read in the New Testament about what Jesus sees. I reckon between all of us, we must have sat through hundreds of thousands of sermons, I reckon, about what Jesus says. And I'm guessing that not too many of us would have heard a gracious, loving interpretation of Matthew 10. "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." Or from Mark, Jesus says, "Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her." Or John 14, "No one comes to the Father except through me," which seems like a bit of a threat. Or maybe if you've been stressed about something and somebody says, "Oh, well, you know what Jesus says, don't worry," and then you feel even worse because you're still worrying and now you feel like a bad Christian as well. So what we're going to do over the next few weeks is we're going to leave the easy stories, right? We're going to leave the stories that get talked about all the time. We're going to leave those ones alone, your good Samaritans, your prodigal sons. We're going to let them go, and we're just going to focus on the hard bits. And I'm going to start with those verses that Dave has just read to us. Now, I think if you've been around churches for a while, this is probably one of the verses that we are covering in this series that you will have heard before. But it was probably taught to you, I would imagine, as a little more than a thinly veiled threat. And when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right, and the goats on his left. And then we skip forward to verse 41. Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." And then we skip forward to verse 46, where it says, then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. It's pretty straightforward, right? The whole world is divided into two camps, and some of them go to heaven and some others go to hell. So you pray the prayer and then God forgives you and then you go to heaven. All right, easy, sermon done, let's all go for lunch. Or maybe not. This morning there are a few things that I'm going to pick up from this passage, but first up, let's immediately get to the big one. This is not a story about who spends eternity in heaven and who spends eternity in hell. Before I explain that, a little quick reminder of what we're reading this morning. Most of you will know that there are 4 books in the New Testament which people call the Gospels, which are 4 different accounts of Jesus' life. And I know that most of you know that. Everybody who preaches here, though, will always introduce these kind of stories like that. Because one of my least favorite things is when preachers assume a load of knowledge, that if somebody walked into a church for the first time, they would have no idea what was going on. We talk about inclusion a lot, and we often talk about LGBT plus inclusion, which is obviously hugely important, but inclusion has to mean more than that. It has to mean creating a church service which is as welcoming for the person who's walked through the door for the first time as it is to those who have grown up in church. So anyway, there are lots of stories about Jesus which are in more than one of these 4 accounts of his life, but this one is only found in the book of Matthew. When they were writing these books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the gospel writers, had slightly different emphases. And one of the ways in which Matthew is different to the other 3 is that Matthew was writing mainly for a Jewish audience. The others were writing more generally, but Matthew had a specific goal in mind. He was trying to convince people, Jewish people, that Jesus was the Messiah, the one that they'd been waiting for, the one that the Jewish texts had promised. And Matthew's Jesus is a bit more like an Old Testament prophet than any of the other Gospels' Jesus. Matthew has more references to the Old Testament than any of the other Gospels, because the point is he's writing this to a Jewish audience and trying to convince them that Jesus is next in this lineage of prophets. And the Old Testament prophets were very black and white, very in or out, very right or wrong. So it makes sense that Matthew's Jesus is similar, and we get verses like we've just read. It seems odd, but it is important to say that these accounts of Jesus' life, they were written by normal people who were inspired by the Holy Spirit, but normal people writing stuff down. There's a verse at the end of John's account where he says there's no room to write down all the things that Jesus said and all the things that he did. So what we have here already is just edited highlights. It's like match of the day rather than watching a live match. But let's get into these verses. All the people in the world will be separated, some on the left and some on the right. And the ones on the left will go away to eternal punishment. Now, as I said earlier, it seems like a pretty straightforward analogy for hell. And Matthew did like talking about hell. Almost all the times that hell is mentioned in the Gospels, it's in Matthew. There are only 2 references to hell in the other 3 accounts. But I think there are 2 issues with talking about eternal punishment like this. Number 1, it's a mistranslation of the word eternal. And number 2, it's a mistranslation of the word punishment. But apart from that, they've got it nailed. This is a book called Love Wins by a guy called Rob Bell. Who has read it? Can anybody remember the controversy around this? It was written in 2011. Rob Bell was a pastor of a massive church in the States at that point, and he wrote a book about heaven, hell, and salvation. And he got into a lot of trouble from people who did believe that eternal punishment was the stuff that I was brought up with, at least. People argued that this was a modern interpretation of heaven and hell, a modern interpretation of salvation. It needed to be rejected, and people needed to stick to the classic interpretations, the things that had been around like quite a long time, like maybe Karl Barth, who said something very similar in the 1930s, or George MacDonald, who said something very similar in the 19th century, or Julian of Norwich, or Friedrich Schleiermacher, who said something very similar in the 18th century, or Julian of Norwich, who said something very similar in the 14th century, or Isaac of Nineveh, who said something very similar in the 7th century, or Gregory of Nyssa, who said something very similar in 400 AD, or finally Origen of Alexandria, who said something very similar in 200 AD. But yeah, we've got to reject this modern translations of things, you know? We've got to go back to the olden days and what people were saying then. Origen of Alexandria in the 2nd century AD said the power of Christ's cross and resurrection is so great that it extends even to the devil and his angels. For it is through correction and chastisement that souls are healed. This word correction is important. In Love Wins, Rob Bell explains that in the original language in Greek, these two words, eternal and punishment, are aeon and kalatzo. Aeon means an age or a period of time, not eternity. And kalatzo refers to this tree that you can see outside the church. A couple of years ago, we had a wedding on a Saturday, and this olive tree was looking pretty terrible. And so Steve spoke to a guy called Dave, who used to work here at the time, and asked him to tidy it up before the wedding. And so Dave, fancying himself as a bit of a gardener, came in on the Friday before the wedding, went across the road to the tool shop, bought some secateurs, and thought, you know that old adage, if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing yourself. And he had a go at cutting back the olive tree. Now, I've got to say, when he finished, it didn't look all that great. The wedding came and went, and the week after, I was in a meeting with Steve and with Dave, and I've got to say, in that meeting, Steve, I'm sure would agree, far too much time was taken up talking about the quality or otherwise of Dave's gardening. I think whatever we were meant to be talking about was about 5 minutes, and we talked the rest of the time about whether he had done a decent job at pruning this back. But Dave said, this tree is not ruined, it will come back stronger for the pruning that he had done. And I've got to say, looking at that photo, it is looking pretty good, isn't it? He didn't do a bad job. Now, you might be thinking, what in the world has that got to do with eternal punishment? And to be fair, if you were, I could not fault you. But kalatzo, the word that we translate as punishment, it's actually a word used in gardening, and it refers to the correct pruning back of branches so they can grow. So it isn't punishment in the way that you might think about it. It's a trimming back. It's a time, not forever, it's a time of correction so that you can learn. It isn't a matter of whether you're in or out, it's a loving correction, helping you to see where you've gone off course and helping you to get back on track. This is Douglas Campbell, a theologian from New Zealand, and he says the difference between this interpretation and the old interpretation is the difference between a job interview and a job evaluation. Lots of people read this story like it's a job interview. You get the job or you don't. You're in or you're out. At the end of that job interview, you've either got the job and you're in, or you don't get the job and you walk away again. But Douglas Campbell says it would be much more accurate if we think about it like a job evaluation. Every year at Oasis we hold what we call personal development reviews, PDRs, and we sit down with our line manager and we talk about the things that we've done over the last year, and we look at the things that we're going to do over the next year. But the point of a PDR is not to decide whether someone's in or out, but to discuss your work, and if necessary, correct the course a little bit. You might need to hold someone accountable for what they've done, but you do that in a restorative way, in a supportive way. You're not letting people get away with anything, but you're correcting their course in a way that aims to build them up, to help them see things differently from now on. The crucial thing is, it's not done to rule you out. It's done to restore you, to support you out of love. So, if this isn't a story of separating those who are going to heaven from those who are going to hell, then what is it about? Let's go back to those verses for a minute. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left, and the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was ill, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will ask him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink?" And so on and so on. And the king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." And then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink." And so on. And then they will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty and did not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for the least of those, you did not do for me." This is an interesting one. Because I think, as I mentioned earlier, lots of us probably, I certainly was, brought up in a church which said that you got saved by praying the prayer. You asked God to forgive your sins, and that's how you got saved. That's what salvation was. But this passage doesn't say that at all. The people who are put on the right side aren't the ones who have prayed a prayer. They are the ones who saw that someone was hungry and fed them, saw that someone was thirsty and gave them something to drink, saw a stranger and invited them in. Actually, all those people who talk about the way we get saved is by praying a prayer, they're not just ignoring this passage, but loads more. Or like the thief on the cross from Luke 23, where he says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." He didn't pray a prayer, ask God to forgive his sins. Or Matthew chapter 7, where it says, Jesus says, "Only those who do the will of my Father will be in the kingdom of heaven." Or Matthew 10, where it talks about persecution, and Jesus says, "Those who stand firm to the end will be saved." Or the woman who wipes Jesus' feet with perfume, and Jesus forgives her of her sins for doing that. Or there are loads more here. People come to be saved in the Gospels in all sorts of different ways. And Jesus forgives their sins each time. But back to these verses. It's an interesting one. Because, like I said, most of us would have thought of the praying the prayer angle instead of the people being put on the right side because they were hungry and they got fed, they were thirsty and they got a drink. The difference, I think, is this. Orthodoxy versus orthopraxy. It isn't about right thinking, which is what orthodoxy does, but right acting. This is a photo of Billy Graham and Martin Luther King. You will know, I'm sure, who they are, but they were both church ministers who attacked this kind of stuff in slightly different ways. Martin Luther King led the civil rights movement, and Billy Graham led massive evangelistic campaigns and spoke at stadia. And Billy Graham, interestingly, was a supporter of equal rights. In 1953, he was booked to do an event at the church, and he turned up, and there was a barrier down the middle of the hall, and all the white people sat on one side, and all the black people sat on another side, because it was in an area of segregation. And Billy Graham walked into the venue, and he saw this, and he refused to go on stage until the barrier was broken down, and the event was desegregated. So he started, as you would think, quite a strong supporter of the civil rights movement. Certainly, he was a strong supporter of equality. But then, as the civil rights movement grew and took off, he walked away from it a little bit because he was critical of the methods that the civil rights movement were using. So practicing civil disobedience, like the Freedom Riders who traveled by public bus through the south of the US in a peaceful protest against segregation. By this point, segregation on public buses was illegal, but in practice it was still happening in the south. And so the Freedom Riders traveled on these buses to make this point. But Billy Graham wasn't in favor of anything like this. He was asked to join the massive march on Washington, and he turned it down. And then Martin Luther King released his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, and Billy Graham was asked about this in the press, and he said, "I think Martin Luther King should put the brakes on a little bit." King said that the protests could create a beloved community in America where even down in Alabama, little black boys and little black girls will join hands with little white boys and white girls. Billy Graham said, "Only when Christ comes again will the white children of Alabama walk hand in hand with the black children." He said, "If the law says I cannot march or demonstrate, I ought not to march and I ought not to demonstrate." And he criticized civil rights activists for focusing, what he said, on changing laws, not changing hearts. I think this is a good example of the battle between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. His focus, Billy Graham, was on saving people for heaven, getting them to think the right things, regardless of what was happening on the streets in front of him. It wasn't a race issue in one respect. Like I said, he had argued against segregation back in the early 50s when there weren't a lot of white preachers doing that. For him, it was a theological problem, I think. I think churches have reinterpreted these verses really badly sometimes. I think you could say that some churches would argue, "For I was hungry and you held a prayer meeting. I was thirsty and you sang some songs. I was a stranger and you preached a sermon about the importance of hospitality. I needed clothes and you had a Bible study. I was ill and you took an offering for the work of the church. I was in prison and you held a big evangelistic rally." Billy Graham focused on life after death so much more than on life before death. And I think we see the outworking of this type of theology that says it's more about your right beliefs than your right action in the US today. It's why Christians vote for Trump, because they write off the terrible stories of the things that he does and the way that he lives, because he says he's a Christian and therefore will uphold Christian values. If he says he believes these things, orthodoxy, that is more important than the way he lives his life, orthopraxy. But it's easy, isn't it, for me to stand here and say what they're doing in the States is so terrible without addressing what's happening on the streets in London. Because I think one of the things that we really need to tackle as the church in the UK at the moment is the co-opting of Christianity by the far right in this country, not over there. A couple of weeks ago, there was this march through London, organised by a guy called Tommy Robinson. You can just about see in this photo, surrounded by security guards. And I acknowledge my privilege in this. I'm a white man, and I took my running shoes on. And before the march started, I went for a run through these streets. I went to the bit where people were congregating to start this rally, and I ran around kind of all the different areas. And I saw lots of crosses, lots of dog collars. You can just about see again in the back of this image. There is a guy there wearing a dog collar, holding a kind of shepherd's staff. And this is a deliberate attempt by Tommy Robinson, by Nigel Farage, by the far right, to co-opt Christianity because they believe, rightly or wrongly, that Christians are likely to be behind their anti-Muslim policies. So they stand for Christian values, orthodoxy, not orthopraxy. They say these things, but they act totally differently. This guy is standing, wearing a dog collar, supporting a guy who's been in jail 5 times, arrested dozens of times for everything from stalking his ex-partner to assault. And that's before you get to his take on immigration and foreigners, which doesn't get a lot of support, I don't think. In the Bible, this is Leviticus 19. When a foreigner resides amongst you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigners residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Or Deuteronomy chapter 10. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. Or Exodus 22. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner. Or Jeremiah chapter 7. If you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless and the widow, then I will let you live in this place. Or Zechariah chapter 7. This is what the Lord Almighty said. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. And I could carry on, and I could carry on, and I could carry on. So how do we respond to this? We can't respond to this by orthodoxy, by saying we've got better things that we think than this. We've got to respond to it by orthopraxy, by doing something, by right doing. See, I think it would be really easy to set up in opposition to everybody who went on that march, to say just because all of those people went on that march supporting a violent racist, it would be easy to say everybody, therefore, who went on that march is a violent racist. But that isn't true, is it? We know that's not true. It's a heck of a lot more nuanced than that. So what do we do? How do we respond to this? I think what we've got to do is we've got to break what they call the grief to grievance pipeline. Right-wing politicians are experts at taking a legitimate grievance, unemployment, poverty, unaffordable housing, and then putting the blame for that on the person that they want to blame, leading to people having a grievance against that people group. I grew up, as lots of you know, in a small town in South Wales where almost everybody was employed basically in either the mine or the steelworks. In the 80s, the mine and the steelworks were closed, and there was a ton of unemployment and loads of poverty in that place. There are more people on sickness benefits in that town than anywhere else in the UK. The unemployment rate is always one of the highest in the UK. And then we get to 2016 and we get to the Brexit vote, and despite the fact that everything in that town that's been built over the last 20 years has been built because of EU funding, people vote for Brexit, to leave the EU. Why do they do that? It's because of the grief to grievance thing. It's because they had a genuine grief around the fact that there was poverty in the area, that the mines closed and they lost their jobs, that the steelworks closed and they lost their jobs, that this sense of community that went alongside both of those places of employment, they lost that. And there is genuine grief there. But what politicians will do is they'll take that genuine grief and they'll turn it into a grievance, and they will say, if we just vote for Brexit, we'll be able to set our own immigration policies, and then we'll be able to cut down on the foreigners who are coming in and taking your jobs. And people vote for that. And nearly a decade on, there are no more jobs there than there used to be. So instead of grief to grievance, what do? There's an Old Testament theologian that I love called Walter Brueggemann, and he wrote a book called Reality, Grief, Hope. He said that when the Israelites were exiled to Babylon in the 6th century before Christ, prophets had 3 jobs: to confront people with reality, to pour out grief, and to find hope amidst the ashes. First, we have to face what's happened and understand why. Next, we have to lean into grief. And when we've done that, and only then can we start to rebuild. There aren't that many political leaders who can hold space for grief. We can talk about what the reality of the situation is. That's pretty straightforward. But that second thing there about holding space for grief, it seems like weakness, I think, if you're a politician. When things haven't gone the way that you've planned it, what you do is you bluster, don't you? You try and say, oh, it's because of this, or you move on, or you argue maybe against it. What you don't do is hold a space for grieving. What you don't do in a community setting, as well as anything else, you don't say, there are legitimate reasons here why you're upset, why you're angry. The closure of the places where you had your jobs and the lack of community that came out of that, that is a legitimate concern. What we need to do is we need to sit with people and grieve before we can move on. Richard Rohr, another theologian, says if we do not transform our pain, we will transmit it. If we don't deal with our grief for these things, we will push it onto somebody else. That's how these things always happen. But there is another way. There's a community organizer in Glasgow called Tess Humble, and she said she saw this in Glasgow in the same way that I've seen it in South Wales. And so what she did is she got people together to tell their stories of grief. And she said, well, people came from all different sectors, all different places, all different backgrounds. And someone stood and they talked about the inequality in Glasgow, the fact that they didn't have anything, but there were so many people with so much. Somebody came here and said, I grew up in Sudan, and told the story of the dictatorship that he'd grown up under. Some people just said a few words. Some people talked about more personal things. And after they'd finished, she invited everyone to write on a piece of paper what that struggle was, what that story was, what they were grieving. And then they threw him in a fire. And she said at that point, we could move on to joy. Anyone who's been bereaved knows that if you try to move on without dealing with the pain, it will end up coming out somewhere else. If we do not transform our pain, we will transmit it. And then as I end, I think if we deal with the grieving process, then we can move on to hope. And I think hope is orthopraxy. I think we find the hope in doing something better. The way to respond to all of this isn't to despair, but to do something. To put ourselves into community, to listen to people from different backgrounds, with different political opinions to you, people who may well have walked on that march, and to get alongside them and find out what it actually is that they're struggling with, and have that conversation openly and generously. Hope is orthopraxy. We need to do something. The other day I was in the office and I was standing at the printer waiting for my printing to finish, and I saw this bit of paper and I just assumed it was rubbish, and so I grabbed it and I went to throw it in the recycling bin, and as I grabbed it I picked it up, and you won't be able to see this because the light on the screen is too bright, but it says, I came to Oasis Hub for help and support. I was very stressed. The service I received was professional, fast and efficient. Everything was dealt with. Many, many thanks to the angel who dealt with me. God bless the charity. I don't know who that person is. I don't know what they came in to talk about. I don't know which one of us it was that worked with her. Many, many thanks to the angel who dealt with me. That has got to be the response, I think, to all of this. It's orthopraxy, not orthodoxy. One more line and then I'll stop. This is Keir Hardie, who is an MP and a Methodist preacher. And I love this line. Not just about saying things, but about doing things. It's fallen off the edge of the screen, but he says, I am an agitator. My work has consisted of trying to stir up divine discontent with wrong. I think if there's a challenge for us this week, it would be that one. Where can we try and stir up a divine discontent with wrong? Michelle.
I hope you weren't answering that question with my name. I'll give it a shot. We're going to do a small moment of reflection. It's going to lead us into our communion service, communion time. Communion at this church is open to everyone. Anyone is welcome to come down to this table to get some juice in this occasion and some bread and to share it as a community, bringing us together as one thing. If it's not easy for you to get down to the communion table, give us a wave. We will bring what is on the communion table to you. There's no reason to feel left out. I was thinking on the passage